Part 167. A Guilty Conscience and a Grudging Heart. The crimes of the people of Taif continued to stack up. Not only did they expel the prophet in the vilest of manners when he sought protection, and reject his call at the siege of Taif, they killed their own chieftain, which was a horrendous act according to their own tribal laws and norms. By 9 after Hijri, when it became increasingly clear that Islam would dominate the peninsula, the people of Taif were terrified that they would be called to task for their actions. Each tribe leader refused to go to the prophet as a delegate, lest they be captured and punished, an incorrect assumption born of their guilty consciences. Eventually, the tribe leaders agreed to all travel together and share the burden. As they arrived in Medina, they met with al-Mughira ibn Shubah, who belonged to the Thaqif. Overjoyed with the prospect that the Thaqif may accept Islam, al-Mughira sprinted towards the prophet. Abu Bakr asked why he was running, to which he explained that he wanted to give the prophet glad tidings of the news. Desperate to bring joy to the prophet, Abu Bakr said,
"I ask you by Allah, allow me to give the prophet the glad tidings."
Out of respect for his seniority, al-Mughira yielded, and Abu Bakr informed the prophet, who was indeed overjoyed. Abu Bakr explained the relevant protocols to the chieftains, such as initiating a conversation with the Salam and addressing the prophet as the messenger of Allah. The chieftains entered upon the prophet and ignored all Abu Bakr's instructions, greeting the prophet with the pre-Islamic greeting of Anim Sabaha, good morning, and referring to him as Muhammad. The prophet ignored their insolence and welcomed them. He treated them most generously and honorably, ordering that a special tent be erected for them inside the mosque. Khalid ibn Sa'id ibn Alas had ties to both the Quraysh and the Thaqif, and was therefore chosen as a mediator in the negotiations. The Thaqif had such a guilty conscience that they were worried about their food being poisoned, so they insisted that Khalid ibn Sa'id eat with them at every meal. Apprehensive, they asked whether they were allowed to make a treaty. The prophet replied that a treaty was available if they accepted Islam. Otherwise, they were to return home. The Thaqif had committed too many crimes to coexist peacefully without accepting Islam. The prophet did not force them to accept Islam, but he did not allow them to negotiate a peace treaty if they did not. The Thaqif realized that their only recourse was to accept Islam. They began inquiring about Islamic rulings. They asked about usury, riba, and the prophet replied by quoting one of the many verses of the Quran prohibiting usury. They asked about fornication, zina, and the prophet similarly explained its prohibition. They asked about drinking alcohol, and the prophet once more quoted the Quran outlining why it is prohibited. The Thaqif conferred internally, but were still resistant. One chieftain protested,
"We will never comply with such demands."
Indeed, without the driving force of faith, forsaking such acts is a tall order. Another chieftain responded frankly,
"What choice do we have?"
A third person added,
"If they can all do it, so can we."
The Thaqif then asked about the most important matter of all, idolatry. They were home to the second most prestigious and central idols of Arabia, Al-Lat, after Hubal. The prophet answered definitively that it is to be destroyed. They requested a 3-year buffer period, and the prophet rejected. They then asked for 2 years, and the prophet rejected. They continued to suggest shorter time frames, and the prophet continued to categorically reject their offers. Eventually they agreed, but requested that the Muslims destroy the idol, as they could not bring themselves to do so. The prophet then taught them the pillars of Islam, and they even attempted to negotiate their obligations. They complained of poor physical health and requested a concession from the prayer, to which the prophet said, "There is no goodness in a religion without prayer." They even requested a concession from wudu, and the prophet likewise rejected their request. Interestingly, when they requested a concession for zakah and jihad, the prophet accepted their request. However, when they left, the prophet remarked to his companions, "They shall give zakah, and they shall perform jihad." Some scholars explain that the prophet made this statement as he knew that once faith entered their hearts, they would fulfill all the tenets of faith. They add that this authority to provide such a concession was specific to the Prophet. Other scholars argue that the leader has the authority to accept temporarily reduced obligations for new Muslims. The reality is that the Taqif did not accept Islam with great enthusiasm and sincerity. They dragged their feet with great reluctance and accepted Islam grudgingly. Islamic authorities are not required to check the hearts of each person to gauge sincerity. Communal benefit outweighs individual sincerity, and Islamic authorities are not tasked with testing one's intention. Moreover, the offspring of the Taqif were practicing Muslims, and they still are over 1,400 years later, further demonstrating the wisdom of prioritizing communal welfare over individual sincerity.